I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the water pooling in my pasture where there had never been water before. It was late March in rural Virginia, just outside of Fredericksburg, and the spring rains had been heavy, but this was different. This was a lake where my horses were supposed to graze. My name is Andrew Ashford, and I had owned these 20 acres of prime pasture land for the better part of 15 years. The property had been in my family for 3 generations before that, passed down from my grandfather who had raised cattle here in the 50s and 60s. When I inherited it, I converted it to a horse boarding operation with 6 stalls in the barn and enough grass to keep a dozen horses happy. It was a good life, quiet and peaceful, exactly what I wanted after 20 years working construction in the city. The pasture had always drained perfectly. There was a natural slope to the land, and water would run off toward the creek that formed the eastern boundary of my property. That creek, Mill Run, had been there for centuries, carved into the landscape by generations of rainfall and snowmelt. It fed into a larger tributary system that eventually made its way to the Rappahannock River. The ecosystem was balanced, predictable, and it worked, until the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association decided it did not work for them anymore. Meadowbrook Heights was a new development, one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions with houses that all looked vaguely the same, painted in approved shades of beige and gray, with approved mailboxes and approved landscaping. They had started building it about 3 years ago on what used to be the old Morrison farm, directly uphill from my property. I had not paid it much attention at first. People need places to live, and I figured we could coexist just fine. The HOA, however, had other ideas about coexistence. I waded into the ankle-deep water in my boots, feeling the cold seep through as I walked toward where the water seemed deepest. My horse, Dakota, watched me from the dry corner of the pasture with an expression that seemed almost accusatory. I had moved all 6 horses to the smaller upper pasture that morning, crowding them into a space meant for half that number. The boarding fees I charged barely covered my costs as it was. If I lost use of the main pasture, I would have to refund money I did not have and find new places for horses I had committed to caring for. The water was flowing, I realized, not just pooling. There was a current, subtle but definite, coming from the western edge of my property, from the direction of Meadowbrook Heights. I followed the flow, my boots making sucking sounds in the mud. The grass was dying already, drowned by water that had been sitting here for what must have been days. I had been out of town for a week, visiting my sister in North Carolina, and had only returned the night before. In the dark, I had not noticed the problem. Now, in the harsh light of morning, it was impossible to miss. At the property line, I found what I was looking for. A new culvert, professionally installed, directing water from the subdivision's storm drains directly onto my land. The concrete pipe was at least 18 inches in diameter, and water was pouring out of it in a steady stream, turning my pasture into a swamp. I stood there for a long moment, watching thousands of gallons flow onto my property. They had not asked permission. They had not even notified me. They had simply decided that my land was a convenient place to dump their stormwater runoff. I pulled out my phone and took pictures, dozens of them from every angle. The culvert, the water, the drowned pasture, my confused horses huddled in the distance. Then I walked back to my truck and drove straight to the county planning office. The woman behind the counter at the Stafford County Planning and Zoning Department looked tired, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Her nameplate read Susan Chen, and she had the patient expression of someone who had heard every possible property complaint. "How can I help you?" she asked. "Someone installed a stormwater pipe that is dumping water onto my property without permission," I said. "I need to know if they had a permit and what I can do about it." She pulled up her computer and asked for my address. I gave her the information, and she typed for a while, clicking through screens. "The Meadowbrook Heights development," she said. "Yes, they filed for a stormwater management modification about 6 months ago." "Did that modification include dumping water onto private property that is not part of their development?" She clicked some more, then frowned. "Let me print this out for you." What she handed me was a set of plans that showed the subdivision's stormwater system. According to the documents, they were supposed to direct all runoff into a retention pond within their own development, which would then release water at a controlled rate into Mill Run Creek. There was no mention of any discharge onto my property. "This is not what they built," I said, pointing to the plans. "They put a pipe that goes directly onto my land." Susan Chen's expression shifted from tired to concerned. "Do you have pictures?" I showed her my phone. She looked through the photos, then made copies of everything. "This is a violation," she said. "They built something that was not in the approved plans. I will have an inspector out there tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow? My pasture is flooding right now." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Ashford, but I cannot get anyone out there today. The inspector has a full schedule. Tomorrow morning is the best I can do." I wanted to argue, but I could see it would not help. I thanked her and left, already planning my next move. Back home, I spent the rest of the day documenting everything. I measured the water depth at various points. I took soil samples from the drowned areas. I photographed the dying grass, the stressed horses, everything. If this was going to be a fight, I wanted ammunition. The next morning, a county inspector named Robert Hayes showed up right on time. He was in his 50s, with the weathered look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. We walked the property together, and I showed him everything. "Yeah, this is not right," he said, examining the culvert. "This was not in the approved plans at all. They were supposed to handle all their stormwater internally." "So what happens now?" "I will issue a violation notice to the HOA. They will have to remove this and fix their system to match the approved plans." "How long will that take?" he grimaced. "That depends on how cooperative they are. Could be a few weeks, could be months if they fight it. My pasture is going to be destroyed by then." "You could try talking to them directly. Sometimes that works faster than the official process." I doubted that, but I decided to try anyway. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA office was located in a small building near the subdivision entrance, next to the community pool and fitness center. The sign out front listed the office hours as Tuesday and Thursday mornings. It was Thursday, so I walked in. The woman behind the desk looked up with a smile that froze when she saw the mud on my boots. Her name tag read, "Margaret Campbell, HOA President." Margaret was exactly what I expected, probably in her early 50s with that carefully maintained appearance that spoke of regular salon visits and expensive skincare. Her blonde hair was cut in a precise bob, and she wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cold. "I'm Andrew Ashford. I own the property directly downhill from this development. Your stormwater pipe is flooding my pasture." Her expression did not change. Our stormwater system was professionally designed and permitted. "It was not built according to the permitted plans," I said. "You have a pipe dumping water onto my property. The county has already cited you for a violation." That got a reaction. Her eyes narrowed. "I do not know what you are talking about. Our system directs water to our retention pond." "Then you need to go look at your western property line, because there is an 18-inch culvert pointing straight onto my land." She stood up, and I noticed she was taller than I expected, maybe 5'9". "Mr. Ashford, I assure you that our system is in full compliance. If you are experiencing drainage issues, that is not our responsibility. The county inspector disagrees with you. You will be getting a violation notice. Then we will address it through proper channels. Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do." I was being dismissed. I stood my ground. "Proper channels are going to take time I do not have. My pasture is being destroyed. I have horses I am responsible for." "That sounds like a personal problem," Margaret said. "Good day, Mr. Ashford." I left before I said something I would regret. On my way out, I passed a man who was coming in, probably in his 30s, wearing khakis and a polo shirt with a landscaping company logo. He gave me a curious look but did not say anything. Over the next week, the situation got worse. It rained twice more, heavy spring thunderstorms, and each time the water on my pasture got deeper. The county violation notice was delivered to the HOA, and according to Robert Hayes, they had 30 days to respond with a corrective action plan. 30 days. My pasture would be a permanent wetland by then. I tried everything I could think of. I called a lawyer, but he wanted a $5,000 retainer just to send a letter. I did not have $5,000 lying around. I contacted the state environmental agency, but they said it was a county issue. I even tried calling Margaret Campbell again, but she would not take my calls. Meanwhile, my boarders were getting anxious. The horses were stressed from being crowded together, and two of the owners were already talking about finding other facilities. I stood to lose nearly $2,000 a month in income if they left. That was when I started really looking at Mill Run Creek. The creek formed the eastern boundary of my property, running south to north before curving east toward the Meadowbrook Heights retention pond. I had always assumed the pond fed the creek, but when I started paying attention, I realized I had it backwards. Mill Run actually fed the retention pond. The water flowed from upstream through my property, and a portion of it was diverted into the HOA's pond system before continuing downstream. The HOA had built their retention pond by essentially damming part of the creek and creating a catchment area. The pond was designed to fill up during heavy rains, then slowly release water back into the creek through a controlled outlet. It was actually a clever design, keeping the subdivision from flooding during storms, but it was also completely dependent on the flow of Mill Run Creek. I spent 2 days walking the creek, following it upstream onto the old Morrison property that had not been developed yet. The creek started from a spring about a mile up, then gathered tributaries as it made its way down the slope. By the time it reached my property, it was a respectable flow, maybe 3 feet wide and a foot deep under normal conditions, and it was entirely on my property. I checked the property survey I had in my files, then walked the boundary lines with a GPS unit to be sure. Mill Run entered my land at the northwest corner and flowed southeast across it. The HOA retention pond was on their property, but the creek that fed it ran across mine. I stood there in the mud, watching the water flow past, and an idea started forming. It was probably a terrible idea. It might even be illegal. But I was watching my livelihood drain away into a flooded pasture, and the people responsible would not even return my phone calls. I called Robert Hayes, the county inspector. Hypothetically, I said, what would happen if I wanted to do some work on the creek that runs through my property? There was a pause. What kind of work? I do not know. Bank stabilization, erosion control, that sort of thing. You would need a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers if you are doing anything that affects the flow of a waterway. Why are you asking? Just curious about my options. Another pause. Andrew, whatever you are thinking about doing, make sure you do it by the book. You do not want to create more problems for yourself. I thanked him and hung up. Then I spent the evening researching water rights, riparian law, and stormwater management regulations. What I found was interesting. In Virginia, property owners have rights to the water that flows through their land, but they also have responsibilities. You cannot completely cut off water flow to downstream properties, but you can make reasonable use of the water on your own land. The definition of reasonable use was where things got fuzzy. I also found that the Army Corps of Engineers permit process could take months or even years, but there were exemptions for certain kinds of minor work, like installing farm ponds or doing erosion control. The next morning, I drove to a farm supply store in Fredericksburg and bought a dozen large drainage tiles, the kind used for farm ponds and irrigation systems. Each one was 4 feet in diameter and 3 feet long, made of corrugated plastic. I also bought a load of river rock and some filter fabric. Then, I drove to a construction equipment rental place and rented a compact excavator for a week. Back home, I spent the rest of the day getting everything ready. I marked out a location on Mill Run where the creek made a natural bend about 100 yards upstream from where it exited my property. The banks were soft there, eroded from years of spring floods. What I was planning was technically a farm pond. I was going to install drainage tiles to direct water into a small retention area on my property, which would help with erosion control and give my horses a place to drink. The fact that this might reduce the flow of water into the HOA's retention pond was just an unfortunate side effect. Or at least, that was my story, and I was sticking to it. I started work the next morning. The excavator was easy to operate. I had plenty of experience with heavy equipment from my construction days. I dug into the creek bank, creating a berm that would redirect the flow. Then, I installed the drainage tiles, setting them in the river rock and wrapping them with filter fabric to prevent clogging. The system I created would allow some water to continue downstream, but most of it would be diverted into a small pond on my property. The pond would slowly release water through a controlled outlet, exactly like the HOA's retention pond was supposed to do. It took me 3 days to complete the work. By the time I was done, I had created a pond about 30 feet across and 4 feet deep, right in the middle of my property. It started filling immediately, clear water from the spring upstream. It was actually beautiful, with cattails already starting to grow around the edges. The creek that continued downstream was now just a trickle, maybe a quarter of its original flow. I returned the excavator and waited to see what would happen. It took less than a week. The weather had been dry, so the impact was immediate. The HOA retention pond started dropping. Without the constant input from Mill Run, it could not maintain its level. The outlet that was supposed to slowly release water into the downstream creek system went dry. My phone rang on a Tuesday morning. I did not recognize the number, but I answered anyway. "Mr. Ashford, this is Margaret Campbell from Meadowbrook Heights HOA. We need to speak with you immediately." "About what?" "About what you have done to the creek. You have cut off the water to our retention pond. I built a farm pond on my property. It is for my horses." "You damned the creek." Her voice was rising. "That is illegal." "I installed erosion control structures on my property. There is still water flowing downstream, just at a reduced rate, kind of like how you installed a pipe that floods my property." There was silence on the other end. Then, in a voice that was dangerously quiet, she said, "Fix it." "I will fix mine when you fix yours," I said. "Remove the pipe that is dumping water on my pasture, and I will remove my farm pond." "You cannot do this. We will sue you." "And I will sue you for the damage to my property. I have documentation of everything. Pictures, county violation notices, the whole thing. How do you think that will go?" She hung up on me. I knew this was far from over, but at least now they were paying attention. The next day, I got a call from a lawyer. Not my lawyer, the HOA's lawyer. His name was Richard something, and he had the smooth, confident voice of someone used to intimidating people over the phone. "Mr. Ashford, I represent the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. Your actions regarding Mill Run Creek constitute an illegal obstruction of a waterway. If you do not remove the dam immediately, we will seek an emergency injunction." "It is not a dam. It is a farm pond with drainage controls," I said, "and there is still water flowing downstream. I checked Virginia water rights law pretty carefully. You cannot substantially reduce the flow of water to downstream properties." Interesting. Does that law also apply to substantially increasing the flow of water onto adjacent properties? Because your clients installed an unpermitted culvert that has been flooding my pasture for weeks. There was a pause. "That is a separate issue." "No, it is really not. Tell you what, have your clients remove their illegal pipe and I will remove my farm pond. Seems fair." "Mr. Ashford, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. The HOA has substantial resources. And I have pictures of dead grass, stressed horses, and a county violation notice against your clients. Plus, I would love to hear you explain to a judge why your clients think they can dump water on my land, but I cannot redirect water on my own property." He tried a few more threats, but I could tell his heart was not in it. The legal situation was murky at best, and they knew it. After he hung up, I sat on my porch and looked out at my property. The flooded pasture was still there, an ugly reminder of what started all this. But my new pond was clear and blue, and I had already seen deer coming to drink from it in the evenings. I knew I was playing a dangerous game. If they really did get an injunction, I would have to comply or face contempt charges. But I was betting they would not want to go to court with their own violations still outstanding. It turned out I was right, but not in the way I expected. 3 days later, I saw trucks at the property line. A crew was working on the culvert. I walked over to watch, and to my surprise, they were not removing it. They were installing a valve system that would let them control the flow. I walked up to the crew chief, a guy in his 40s with a sunburned face. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Installing flow controls," he said. "HOA wants to be able to shut off the discharge when it is not needed." "The county violation says they're supposed to remove this entirely," he shrugged. "I just do what I'm told. You got a problem? Talk to them." I pulled out my phone and called Robert Hayes. "They are not removing the culvert," I told him. "They are installing valves." That is not compliance with the violation notice, or he said, I will send them a follow-up letter. How long is this going to take? Andrew, the process takes as long as it takes. If they do not comply, we can eventually take them to court, but that could be months. So I am just supposed to let my business fail while we wait for the process? I understand your frustration, but my hands are tied. Follow the process. I hung up and stood there watching the crew work. The process was not working. The process was designed for people who could afford to wait, who had lawyers and resources and time. I had horses depending on me and boarders threatening to leave. That evening, I went back to my pond and made some adjustments to the drainage tiles. I reduced the downstream flow even more. Not to nothing, there was still water getting through, but it was barely a trickle now. The next morning, Margaret Campbell showed up at my property in person. She was driving a white Mercedes SUV and wearing designer jeans with heels that immediately sank into my muddy driveway. She picked her way toward my porch with an expression of disgust. Mr. Ashford, we need to talk. About what? About being reasonable adults. This situation has gotten out of hand. I leaned against the porch railing and waited. She took a breath. The creek situation is causing problems for our retention pond. The water level is dropping, and it is affecting the landscaping around the pond. Some of the trees are showing stress. That sounds like a personal problem, I said, echoing her words from our first meeting. Her jaw tightened. I'm trying to find a solution here. The solution is simple. Remove the pipe that is flooding my pasture. We need that discharge point. Our retention pond cannot handle all the stormwater from the subdivision without additional overflow capacity. Then you should have designed your system better. That is not my problem. Mr. Ashford, please, can we discuss this reasonably? I have been reasonable. I filed a complaint through proper channels. I talked to the county. I even came to your office to try to work this out directly. You dismissed me. You told me it was my personal problem, so I found my own solution. By illegally damming a creek. By installing erosion control on my property. If it happens to reduce the flow downstream, well, I am making reasonable use of my water rights. She looked at me for a long moment. What do you want? Remove the culvert, restore my pasture, pay for the damage to my grass and the cost of boarding my horses elsewhere while it recovers. That could cost $50,000 or more. Then you should not have dumped water on my property without permission. She turned and walked back to her Mercedes, her heels making little holes in my driveway. Before she got in, she turned back. This is not over, she said. I know, I replied. That weekend, I got a visit from the county sheriff. Deputy Martinez was young, maybe late 20s, and he looked uncomfortable. Mr. Ashford, I have a complaint that you have illegally obstructed a waterway. Who filed the complaint? The Meadowbrook Heights HOA. They say you built a dam on Mill Run Creek. I invited him to walk the property with me. We went to the pond, and I showed him the drainage tiles and the erosion control setup. Is there water still flowing downstream? He asked. Yes, right there. I pointed to the trickle continuing past the pond. And you did not completely block the creek? No, I installed farm pond infrastructure on my property. This is all within my property boundaries. He took some pictures and notes. The HOA is claiming you are retaliating against them for a civil dispute. They flooded my pasture first. I have county documentation of their violation. He nodded slowly. Look, Mr. Ashford, I cannot tell you what to do, but this seems like something that should be settled in civil court, not criminal. I will file my report, but I do not see any criminal activity here. You might want to talk to a lawyer, though. After he left, I knew I needed legal help. I could not afford the lawyer I had talked to before, but I found a younger attorney named Patricia Morrison who had just opened her own practice. She agreed to consult with me for a reasonable fee. Patricia was in her early 30s, sharp and energetic, with red hair pulled back in a ponytail. She listened to my whole story, reviewed all my documentation, and then sat back in her chair. This is a mess, she said, but it is an interesting mess. Can they force me to remove the pond? Maybe. Virginia water law gives you rights to reasonable use of water on your property, but you cannot substantially interfere with downstream users. The question is what counts as substantial interference. There is still water flowing. Yes, but if they can show that the reduced flow is causing them real harm, they might have a case. On the other hand, they have their own violation for flooding your property. That gives you leverage. So what do? We offer to negotiate. You remove your pond, they remove their culvert and pay damages. Everyone goes back to the way things were, minus some legal fees. And if they refuse? Then we go to court and it gets expensive for everyone, which is why they will probably negotiate. She drafted a letter laying out the proposal. Remove the culvert, pay for pasture restoration and lost boarding fees, and I would remove the pond. She gave them 2 weeks to respond. They responded in 10 days. Their answer was no. They claimed their culvert was a temporary measure while they worked on a permanent solution, and they would not pay damages for what they called an act of nature. They demanded I remove the pond immediately or face legal action. Patricia was not surprised. HOAs hate admitting fault. It sets a precedent, but their position is weak. The county has already cited them for a violation. So now what? Now we wait for them to file suit, or we file first. I recommend we go on offense. Sue them for trespass, property damage, and lost income. Force them to defend their actions. How much will that cost? She named a figure that made me wince. I did not have that kind of money just sitting around. I would have to take out a loan, maybe even mortgage the property. I was still trying to figure out what to do when the situation escalated again. It was a Thursday afternoon when I heard the equipment. I walked down to the creek and found a crew with an excavator digging on the HOA's side of the property line. They were trying to deepen the channel to increase water flow from the trickle that was getting past my pond. I called out to them. "What are you doing?" The crew chief, the same sunburned guy from before, shook his head. "HOA orders. We are trying to improve the flow from the creek. You are on my property line. Make sure you stay on your side. We are being careful." I watched them work for a while, then went back to the house and called Patricia. "They are trying to increase the flow by digging out the creek channel," I told her. "On their property?" "Right at the property line. I am worried they are going to damage the boundary." "Document everything. Take pictures, videos, measurements. If they cross onto your property, call the sheriff immediately." I spent the rest of the afternoon monitoring the crew. They stayed on their side of the line, but just barely. The excavator got close enough that I could see the paint scratches on the bucket. By evening, they had deepened about a 100-yard stretch of the creek channel. It did not help them much. Without more water coming from upstream, a deeper channel was just a deeper, empty ditch. That night, it started to rain. Not a gentle spring shower, but a real storm, the kind that turns roads into rivers and knocks out power. I sat on my porch and watched the lightning, thinking about what was happening to the water systems on both properties. My pond would be filling up, probably overflowing. The extra water would go downstream, helping the HOA's retention pond. But their culvert would also be running full blast, dumping even more water onto my already saturated pasture. By morning, the flooded area of my pasture had spread. Water was now covering almost 3 acres, and it was deep enough that I could not even see the grass anymore. It looked like a small lake. I walked down to check on my pond. As I expected, it was overflowing, sending a much larger volume of water downstream. But the drainage tiles were working exactly as designed, directing most of the water into the pond first, letting it settle, then releasing it slowly. The HOA retention pond would be filling back up now, but it would not help them in the long run. As soon as the rain stopped and my pond level dropped, the flow would go back to a trickle. I was taking pictures of the new flooding when my phone rang. It was Patricia. "Andrew, I need you to come to my office. The HOA filed suit this morning." The lawsuit was everything I expected and worse. They were suing me for injunctive relief to force me to remove the pond, plus damages for the harm to their retention pond and surrounding landscaping. They claimed I had violated Virginia water rights law and caused them over $100,000 in damages. Patricia and I spent 2 hours going through the complaint. "Can they win?" I asked. They have a case, but so do we. The key is going to be whether the court views your pond as a reasonable use of your property rights or as retaliation against them." "It is both," I admitted. She smiled slightly. "Never say that in court. The story is that you built a farm pond for legitimate agricultural purposes. The fact that it also gives you leverage in your dispute with them is just a coincidence. Will a judge believe that? Judges have seen everything. What matters is what we can prove. We have documentation that they violated county regulations first. We have evidence of damage to your property. We have a strong argument that you were within your rights to build the pond. We filed our response and a countersuit. We claimed trespass, property damage, loss of income, and asked for both compensatory and punitive damages. We also asked the court to order the HOA to remove the culvert immediately. The legal process ground forward slowly. Discovery, depositions, motions, and counter-motions. It was expensive and exhausting. I had to take out a second mortgage on the property to pay the legal bills, 2 more boarders left, cutting my income to almost nothing. Meanwhile, the pond stayed and the trickle downstream stayed small. The HOA retention pond stayed half empty, and their landscaping continued to suffer. According to my sources, there were residents complaining at HOA meetings about the ugly brown grass around the pond and the trees that were dying from drought stress. Margaret Campbell left me several increasingly angry voicemails, which I saved as evidence. In one particularly memorable rant, she called me a vindictive asshole who was destroying property values out of spite. Patricia loved that one. The first court hearing was in early June, 3 months after this whole thing started. It was just a preliminary hearing to address the HOA's request for an emergency injunction to force me to remove the pond. Judge Patricia Williams presided. She was an older woman, maybe in her 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened to both sides present their arguments. The HOA's lawyer, Richard, argued that I had illegally obstructed a waterway and was causing ongoing harm to his client's property. He showed pictures of the half-empty retention pond and the stressed landscaping. Patricia countered with pictures of my flooded pasture and the county violation notice against the HOA. She argued that I had every right to build a farm pond on my property, and that the HOA had no standing to complain when they were actively violating county regulations by flooding my land. Judge Williams looked at all the evidence, asked pointed questions of both sides, and then made her ruling. "I am not issuing an injunction at this time," she said. "Both parties appear to have legitimate grievances. The HOA has flooded Mr. Ashford's property, and Mr. Ashford has reduced water flow to the HOA's retention pond. These issues need to be resolved together, not separately. I am ordering both parties to mediation. You have 30 days to reach a settlement. If you cannot settle, we will proceed to trial." It was not a win, but it was not a loss either. More importantly, it meant the pond could stay while we negotiated. The mediator was a retired judge named Harold Chen. He was probably in his 70s, with the patient demeanor of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with people at their worst. We met in a conference room at the county courthouse. On one side was me and Patricia. On the other side was Margaret Campbell, Richard the lawyer, and 2 other HOA board members I had not met before. Harold started by laying out the ground rules. Everything said in mediation was confidential. The goal was to find a solution both sides could live with. He would talk to each side separately, then together, until we reached an agreement or gave up. He started with the HOA. I could hear Margaret's voice through the wall, high and angry, though I could not make out the words. After about an hour, Harold came to our room. "They are not happy," he said mildly. "Mrs. Campbell in particular feels very strongly that you are in the wrong." "What are they offering?" Patricia asked. "They will agree to install a valve on the culvert that will only be opened during heavy rains. In exchange, you remove the pond and drop your lawsuit." "What about damages for the flooding that already happened?" I asked. "They claim that was an act of nature that they are not responsible for." Patricia shook her head. "Not acceptable. They violated county regulations. They are liable for the damage." We went back and forth for hours. The HOA would offer something, we would counter, they would refuse. By late afternoon, we were no closer to an agreement. Harold called us all into the same room. "Let me be blunt," he said. "If you cannot settle this, you're going to trial. Trials are expensive. Trials are unpredictable. You could each spend $50,000 or more on legal fees, and there's no guarantee either of you will win. Is that really what you want?" Margaret Campbell spoke up. "Mr. Ashford created this situation by illegally damming the creek. If he would just admit fault and fix it, this would all be over." "Your HOA created this situation by flooding my pasture without permission," I shot back. "If you had just asked, or better yet, followed your approved plans, none of this would have happened. We did what we had to do to protect our residents." "By destroying my property?" Harold held up his hands. Enough? You both made choices that led to this situation. The question is how you move forward. We kept talking. Harold was good at his job, patient and persistent. Slowly, very slowly, the outlines of a deal started to emerge. The HOA would remove the culvert entirely and restore my pasture to its original condition. They would pay me $20,000 for damages and lost income. In exchange, I would remove the pond and restore the creek to its natural flow. Both sides would drop all lawsuits and sign a mutual release. It was not everything I wanted. $20,000 would not cover all my costs, but it would pay off most of my legal bills and give me enough to get the pasture professionally restored. The sticking point was the timing. I wanted them to fix my pasture first, then I would remove the pond. They wanted it simultaneous. Neither of us trusted the other to follow through. Harold suggested an escrow arrangement. The HOA would put the $20,000 in escrow. They would remove the culvert and restore the pasture. Once I certified the work was complete, I would remove the pond. After I removed the pond, the money would be released to me. Margaret did not like it, but her lawyer eventually convinced her it was the best deal she was going to get. We had the agreement written up and signed that evening. The work started the next week. The HOA hired a professional excavation and landscaping company. They removed the culvert, filled in the drainage ditch, and graded my pasture back to its original slope. Then they brought in topsoil, reseeded the grass, and installed temporary irrigation to help it establish. It took 3 weeks. I inspected every step of the work, and to my surprise, they did a good job. The pasture looked better than it had in years. The grass came in thick and green, and by mid-July, my horses were grazing on it again. I kept my end of the bargain. I rented the excavator again and removed the pond. I pulled out the drainage tiles, filled in the depression, and restored the creek bank. Within a day, Mill Run was flowing normally again, carrying water downstream to the HOA retention pond. Their pond refilled in less than a week. The landscaping started to recover, and the trees stopped looking stressed. The escrow released the $20,000. After I paid Patricia and settled my other bills, I had about $8,000 left. It was enough to catch up on my mortgage and have a little cushion. 2 of my boarders came back, and I got 3 new ones through word of mouth. By August, my pasture was fully recovered, and I had a waiting list for stalls. Life got back to normal, or as normal as it gets. I saw Margaret Campbell once more at the county planning office when I was filing for a permit to expand my barn. She walked past without saying a word, but I caught the look she gave me. It was pure poison. I did not care. My property was restored, my business was growing, and I had learned an important lesson about standing up for myself when institutions tried to push me around. The Meadowbrook Heights retention pond worked exactly as it was designed to work, now that they were not trying to dump excess water on my land. The subdivision continued to grow, and eventually, the county required them to install additional stormwater management before approving any more construction. Sometimes I walk down to where the pond used to be. The creek flows clear and steady there, the banks thick with grass and wildflowers. You would never know there had been a fight over this little stretch of water or that it had nearly bankrupted me to defend it. But I know. And I know that sometimes the only way to deal with people who will not listen is to make them pay attention. The HOA thought they could ignore me because I was just one guy with a small farm. They learned differently. My pasture had never looked better. Dakota and the other horses grazed contentedly, and in the evenings, deer still came down to drink from Mill Run Creek. The ecosystem had found its balance again, and so had I. The story could have ended there, but there was one more chapter I did not expect. About 6 months after everything was settled, I got a call from Robert Hayes, the county inspector. "Andrew, you might want to come down to the planning office. There's something you should see." I drove down that afternoon. Robert was waiting with Susan Chen, and they both looked serious. "What's going on?" I asked. Susan pulled up some documents on her computer. "We have been doing a routine audit of the Meadowbrook Heights development permits. We found some irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that involve Margaret Campbell and the development company having a financial relationship that should have been disclosed. She was receiving payments from the developer in exchange for expediting approvals and overlooking certain violations." I stared at them. You're saying she was taking bribes? We are saying there are serious questions about the approval process for that development. We have referred it to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office for investigation. Over the next several months, the investigation expanded. It turned out Margaret Campbell had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for years. She had steered contracts to companies that gave her kickbacks. She had approved violations for friends while cracking down on enemies. She had even embezzled HOA dues to fund her lifestyle. The stormwater issue that started everything was just the tip of the iceberg. When she had approved the modification to dump water on my property, she had done it as a favor to the developer who was trying to cut costs. It was never about engineering necessity. It was about money. The scandal broke in the local newspapers in November. Margaret Campbell was arrested and charged with embezzlement, bribery, and fraud. Several other people connected to the development were charged as well, including 2 county employees who had taken bribes to overlook violations. The HOA fell apart. The residents, many of whom had no idea what Margaret had been doing, were furious. They held emergency elections and installed a completely new board. The new board immediately hired a forensic accountant to figure out where all the money had gone. I was interviewed by investigators multiple times. They were very interested in the stormwater situation and how it had been approved. My documentation and pictures ended up as evidence in the criminal case. The trial was in the spring, almost exactly a year after the flooding started. I attended several days of testimony. Margaret Campbell sat at the defense table, looking smaller somehow, less intimidating. Her expensive clothes and perfect hair could not hide the fear in her eyes. The prosecution laid out a pattern of corruption spanning 3 years. Margaret had taken over $200,000 in bribes and kickbacks. She had embezzled another $100,000 from HOA dues. She had used her position to enrich herself while neglecting her duties to the homeowners she was supposed to serve. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. Margaret Campbell got 4 years in prison and was ordered to pay full restitution. Her lawyer tried to argue for leniency, claiming she was a first-time offender who made mistakes. The judge was not impressed. Mrs. Campbell held a position of trust, the judge said. She betrayed that trust repeatedly and deliberately for personal gain. She showed no remorse and took no responsibility. The sentence is appropriate for the crimes committed. Several of the county employees took plea deals and got probation in exchange for testimony. The developer paid a large fine and agreed to fix all the code violations in Meadowbrook Heights at their own expense. The new HOA board reached out to me with an apology. They were mortified by what had happened and wanted to make things right. I appreciated the gesture, but I told them the settlement we had already reached was sufficient. I just wanted to move on. Life did move on. My horseboarding business thrived. I expanded the barn like I had planned and added 4 more stalls. I had a full wait list of people wanting to board their horses with me. The pasture that had been flooded was now the best grazing area on the property. Something about all that water and the new topsoil had made the grass grow incredibly thick and green. The horses loved it. Mill Run Creek continued to flow through my property, carrying water downstream to the Meadowbrook Heights retention pond, which now worked exactly as it was supposed to. The ecosystem had found its balance. I never did build another pond, though sometimes I thought about it. Not to make a point or gain leverage, but because it had actually been nice having that water feature on the property. Maybe someday, when the memory of all this had faded a bit more, I would put in a proper farm pond with the right permits and professional help. But for now, I was content. I defended my property, stood up to people who thought they could push me around, and come out the other side intact. My horses were healthy, my business was growing, and my land was restored. The whole experience had taught me something important about power and how it works. The HOA had seemed powerful with their lawyers and their regulations and their threats, but that power was built on a foundation of corruption and intimidation. When challenged, when forced to justify themselves in the light of day, that power crumbled. Real power, I learned, comes from being in the right and being willing to stand your ground. It comes from documentation and persistence and not backing down when people try to bully you. It comes from understanding your rights and defending them. I thought about that sometimes when I sat on my porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over the pasture. Dakota would be grazing nearby, content and peaceful. Mill Run would be flowing steadily, the sound of water over rocks a constant background music. Everything was as it should be. One evening in late summer, almost 18 months after this whole thing started, I saw a truck pull up my driveway. It was one of the landscapers who had worked on the crew that restored my pasture. His name was Carlos, and I had talked to him several times during the work. He got out and walked over. "Mr. Ashford, I hope you do not mind me stopping by." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" "I just wanted to tell you something. When we got hired to do the work on your pasture, the boss told us to do it right. He said you had stood up to the HOA and won, and you deserved the best work we could do. He wanted word to get around that he was the guy who treated people fairly." "I appreciate that. You all did excellent work. We heard what happened to Mrs. Campbell, about the trial and everything." He shook his head. "A lot of us who worked on that development knew something was not right. The corners that got cut, the cheap materials, the things we were told to ignore. But you do not say anything because you need the work." "I understand. When you fought back, when you built that pond, people noticed. It showed that the HOA was not untouchable. I think that is part of why the investigation happened. People started asking questions because you proved they could be challenged." After he left, I thought about what he said. I had not set out to expose corruption or bring down a criminal enterprise. I had just wanted to protect my property and my livelihood. But sometimes standing up for yourself does more than solve your immediate problem. Sometimes it opens doors for others, gives them courage, shows them that the powerful are not as powerful as they pretend to be. The horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. Mill Run flowed clear and steady. The sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Everything was right with my little corner of the world. I had started this journey angry and desperate, watching my pasture flood while bureaucrats told me to wait and follow the process. I had built a dam out of frustration and revenge, a way to force people to pay attention when they would not listen. But in the end, it became about something bigger, about standing up for what was right, about refusing to be a victim, about proving that one person, even without money or power or connections, could make a difference if they were willing to fight. The story of the HOA and the diverted stormwater had become local legend. People still talked about it at the feed store and the coffee shop. Some people thought I was crazy for taking on the HOA. Others thought I was a hero. I was neither. I was just a guy who loved his land and was not willing to let anyone take it from me. As darkness fell, I went inside and made dinner. Through the window, I could see the pasture, dark and peaceful. Tomorrow the horses would graze there again. Tomorrow Mill Run would flow through my property like it had for centuries. Tomorrow life would go on, normal and steady and good. And if another HOA ever tried to dump water on my land again, well, I knew exactly what to do. The end of the story was not dramatic. There were no more confrontations, no more legal battles. Life simply returned to normal, the way it should have been all along. Margaret Campbell served her time. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA got new management and operated properly. My pasture thrived and my business grew. Sometimes the best ending is just peace, the absence of conflict, the quiet satisfaction of knowing you stood your ground and won. That was enough for me. Years later, I would still walk down to Mill Run Creek and watch the water flow. I would remember the pond I had built there, the stand I had taken. I would remember being scared and angry and determined all at once, and I would smile because I had learned that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences. The water kept flowing, carrying with it the memory of that summer when one man with an excavator proved that the powerful could be challenged, that justice could be found, and that sometimes the best weapon against bureaucracy was the simple willingness to say no. My pasture was green, my horses were happy, my life was good. And somewhere downstream, the Meadowbrook Heights retention pond worked exactly as it was designed to work, fed by the clear waters of Mill Run Creek that flowed through my property, as it always had and always would. That was my story. The story of how an HOA diverted stormwater onto my pasture and how I dammed the creek that fed their retention pond. It was a story about property rights and corruption, about standing up and fighting back. But most of all, it was a story about the simple truth that your land is worth defending. And sometimes the only way to protect what is yours is to take a stand. Even if it seems crazy, even if it seems impossible. I took that stand. And in the end, I won. Not because I was smarter or stronger or had more resources, but because I refused to give up, refused to be a victim, refused to accept that the powerful could do whatever they wanted without consequences. The land remembered. The creek remembered. And I would never forget the summer I went to war with an HOA over water and came out the other side with my property intact and my dignity preserved. It was enough. It was everything.